about Slavoj Zizek, who has been variously characterized as the eldest of cultural theory, the most dangerous philosopher in the West, and the world's leading Marxist philosopher. He's even been named by the neoconservative Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 most important global public intellectuals alive today. This panel has already generated a certain amount of controversy online and even a little bit of admiration. And I have no doubt that some in attendance will disagree with what our panelists have to say today, but you'll have an opportunity to respond to and question the panelists later this afternoon. So I would ask that you hold comments until then. My name is Jacob Levich. I'm no expert on Zizek. I'm here purely to moderate and facilitate and leave the analysis to the panelists and to you. But I will put in a plug for a panel that I have I'm running tomorrow called Toxic Philanthropy, the Gates Foundation, Public Health and Imperialism. That's going to be at noon tomorrow, and that is a panel, that is a subject in which I have some small amount of expertise, whereas today I have very little to none. By way of introduction, let me quote from a profile of Zizek that appeared recently in the New York Review of Books. Born and educated in Ljubljana, the capital of the People's Republic of Slovenia, in the former Yugoslav Federation, until the federal state began to break up, and Slovenia declared independence in 1990. Zizek has held academic positions in Britain, America, and Western Europe, as well as in Slovenia. His prodigious output, over 60 volumes since his first book in English, The Sublime Object of Ideology, was published in 1989. Innumerable articles and interviews, together with films such as Zizek, that's with an exclamation point, and The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, have given him a presence that extends far beyond the academy. Well-attuned to popular culture, particularly film, he has a following among young people in many countries, including those of post-communist Europe. He has an entire journal dedicated to his work, the International Journal of Zizek Studies, founded in 2007, whose readership is registered via Facebook. And in October 2011, he addressed members of the Occupy movement in Zuccotti Park in New York, an event that was widely recorded and can be viewed on YouTube. If anything, the summary I've just quoted understates the breadth of Zizek's fame and the depth of his influence. His thoughts on current affairs are disseminated to a global audience through columns in The Guardian, London Review of Books. He's a regular presence on the BBC, Le Monde, the New York Times, the New Left Review, Rupert Murdoch's Vice, La Repubblica, Der Spiegel, et al. Books are consistently among the best-selling academic literature in the English language. For many mainstream newspapers and television news broadcasts, Zizek is the go-to leftist for commentary on the latest obsessions in popular culture and political affairs. He has become virtually an industry in himself. Now, as Marxists and as consumers of mass media, I hope all of us have at this point learned to take a critical attitude toward ideas and narratives that are enthusiastically promoted by mainstream. We know, for instance, that many of the leading leftish journals of the 1950s, including Encounter and the Partisan Review, were funded by the U.S. by a front organization, a CIA front organization known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. We know that one of the most effective pieces of war propaganda preceding the First Gulf War, a story about Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators in a Kuwait hospital, was a complete fabrication concocted by what was then the world's largest public relations firm, Bill and Knowlton. We know from the investigative journalist and Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Carl Bernstein that U.S. intelligence agencies work hand in glove with major news organizations. I could go on, but my point is simply this. In a world of ubiquitous stealth marketing, covert propaganda operations, internet sock puppets, etc., things are seldom what they seem. So I would ask you to listen with an open mind as our panelists take a close look at the agenda of Slavoj Zizek and his legion of acolytes and promoters. Now, I should say that John Stepling and Hannah Wolf, who were listed to be on this panel, were unable to attend today. So we do have today Molly Klein and Ethan Hallerman, and we'll start by hearing from Ethan Hallerman, who is a graduate student in philosophy.
Hi, guys. Thanks, Jake. So more and more there have been reviews of Zizek's work published that have expressed concern that he is or effectively is a fascist or left fascist. Writers have expressed concern about his praise of authoritarian violence, his contempt for democracy and its defenders, his vituperation against anti-racism and feminism. There's one defense of this against this I want to look at. This is something that was published by Adam Kosko, who's written on Zizek. He published an article in the Elliott Review of Books that was meant to present an alternate way of reading Zizek that would show why these concerns are baseless. Kosko says that these dismissals of Zizek are meant to say that left-wing thinkers are, quote, simultaneously laughable and dangerous, disorganized and totalitarian, overly idealistic and driven by a lust for power, all just to suggest that there is no alternative. But many of Zizek's critics are on the left and criticize him because he carries on in what's very much a performance of laughable, disorganized, authoritarian leftists. Kosko suggests that critics suffer from the same kind of symptomatic contradictoriness Zizek purports to diagnose, that the readers of a review of his work always learn that he's politically dangerous and a clown with no program, that he's an apologist for the worst excesses of 20th century communism, and a total right-wing reactionary, both a world-famous left-wing intellectual and an anti-Semite to rival Hitler himself. But the oppositions that the article sarcastically sets up here aren't intrinsically contradictory in the way that it's meant to suggest. Since someone can be politically pernicious with an incoherent program, can praise authoritarian violence because they're a right-wing reactionary, and can be labeled a left-wing intellectual while also being a racist. Kosko proposes that we should read Zizek's right-wing statements as a performance of over-identification. In other words, the claim is Zizek takes up and habits and advocates for right-wing ideas in order to show their contradictions, which is basically kind of just a pretty standard definition of immanent critique. It's nothing particular to Zizek. What's distinct is the identification part, the idea that he has to spend his time arguing for these views in order to then show the contradictions. This is potentially, at first glance, I think an elegant explanation, and I think it works in some cases, but there are a lot of exceptions. I also want to point out that at a minimum, like the best case scenario version of this, to do this, Zizek has to spend his time conceding a huge amount to the legitimacy of dominant media narratives, legitimating their factual inaccuracies and ideological mystifications. But this also ends up basically working as an apologetic theology of Zizek, because it's still totally dependent on the reader to kind of figure out which are the things that Zizek is, performatively, ironically inhabiting and what he means. It ends up amounting to being able to say, well, whatever we don't like, that's what he's performing. So he actually ends up meaning whatever it is that we think he should have meant. We can sort of assign anything he says that we're uncomfortable with as being, oh, he doesn't mean that, he's just pretending. So I want to look at some instances to see whether this actually works as an explanation. Zizek has a habit of publishing on issues in the news cycle in a way that pushes discourse to the right. So, for example, the hagiography of Margaret Thatcher that he published in the New Statesman, which participated in a mass capitulation by nominally leftish mainstream media to Thatcher's suddenly great legacy, went even further than the typical boilerplate about her strong leadership style to advocate for mystical Schmittian political theology. Now, I know Schmitt is very in right now academically. I'm not saying that everything that tries to draw on right-wing thought is, irrevocably tainted by fascism, but people should at least have a very good reason for using it, since Schmitt was a Nazi who did directly take his project as an apologetics for Nazi glorification of the Führer. Although Zizek doesn't mention Schmitt, he misattributes the theory to Winston Churchill. On the sheet here, you can see the first paragraph of the article. So look at how Zizek uses the Schmittianism. It's not for just constructing some general theory of sovereignty, like Agamben or something, but it's for praising the necessity of the kind of sovereign that Schmitt admired, a single individual with absolute power of decision. He even capitalizes the word master throughout this whole thing. Someone who, through force of will, operating beyond question, is going to break through the deadlocks of liberal society's vitiating consensus process. This is a common theme of Zizek's. Now, his anti-democracy, he's let us know now on many occasions, isn't a performance. It's something he sincerely believes, although that's changed over the years. But it is one reactionary view that he's led on, he holds sincerely. And it's easy, I mean, if you read the article, the Thatcher one, it's easy post-Occupy Wall Street to talk about whether leftists need certain kinds of decision-making structures and organization. That's not what Zizek is doing. That's his entry, but what he ends up doing is he fences in and presents the debate around this in a certain way. First, he completely collapses any distinction among things like anarchist horizontalism and liberal democracy. All of that just gets characterized as democracy in general, and then he sets up this cartoonish opposition between all these forms of democracy and the only alternative, which is some kind of authoritarian dictator with a power of absolute decision. So, you see this again and again with Zizek. You have this really superficial reading that could excuse it, but there's no internal necessity for all the Nazi rhetoric about the unquestionable master to make this point. He constructs this false field of options, this weak left liberal one, and this very specifically, rhetorically specific fascist characterization of leadership to say the latter is preferable. There's no real way to excuse this kind of decision by saying it's over-identification because he's not criticizing the Nazi political theology. It's the view that he's advocating. We can see this in other instances also. So one of Zizek's main themes is the value of the European legacy and its relationship to multiculturalism. He's written about this a lot. There was a New York Times op-ed in 2006 that he published called called Defenders of the Faith. That was set up as a response to the protests over the cartoons of Muhammad that were published in a Danish newspaper. Here also, the moment of reversal never actually comes. The whole thing is this blatantly Euro-supremacist bombast about the threat from an irrational Muslim horde. It opens with this Richard Dawkins type attack on religion as such, which is actually directed at Muslims. Leftists are always happy to make fun of Dawkins, rightly so, when he kind of spews this stuff as this, superficially coded white supremacist bile. But Zizek always gets a pass. This happens even though Zizek, who claims to be a Marxist, his public interventions are never materialist, Marxist, they're not even anti-capitalist. The whole thing relies on these Fox News level mainstream media stereotypes. His whole analysis of the issue relies on him drawing his own cartoon. So he says, these weird alliances confront Europe's Muslims with a difficult choice. The only political force that does not reduce them to second-class citizens and allows them the space to express their religious identity are the godless atheist liberals. While those closest to their religious social practice, their Christian mirror image, are their greatest political enemies. All the action of these events, everything that actually happened, for example, that there was a group of Danish imams that took the newspaper to court over this because they felt that it violated Danish laws against hate speech. All of that's erased. The whole thing is reduced to this kind of cartoonish stereotype where you've got these three positions that are abstracted into some kind of generalized significance so that Zizek can make his banal points about a clash of civilizations. He does this operation constantly. Describe a specific political conflict in terms of these discrete sections that he's kind of arbitrarily divided it into. Describe to each section some kind of intrinsic conceptual significance, like an action figure or a piece on a game board, and then rearrange the game pieces to propose a resolution at the conceptual level that has no relationship to the actual events. He goes on to say, what makes modern Europe unique is that it's the first and only civilization in which atheism is a fully legitimate option, not an obstacle to any public post. So, okay, this is factually false for any number of reasons, and obviously, any of us could think of any number of non-European countries, or civilizations if you want, where atheism is permitted. As the saying goes, it's pure ideology. The idea of this discrete civilization, Europe, that has this essence of being this unique secular space. This is a piece of ideology with a specific history that fits alongside Zizek's Clash of Civilizations rhetoric perfectly. Zizek always says ideology is really important. We really think about ideology, but he's always dispensing these kinds of right-wing cliches in his op-eds. He says that because atheism, unlike religious behavior, permits autonomous ethical choice, it's modern Europe's most precious legacy. So Zizek's rigorous argument here is that Europe is the unique space in the world where autonomous ethical behavior is permitted. I mean, he goes on like this. He says, respect for others' beliefs is the highest value will only mean that we end up treating others patronizingly, or we adopt, some kind of harmful relativism. This is characteristic of this kind of country operation as well. A false choice is imposed, so that we'll pick a side. Zizek is the only one talking about respect for others' beliefs as the highest value, but we don't really need it as a highest value to know that going into the New York Times to talk about Europe needing to defend itself from violent Muslims isn't something that we should be expecting from a leading leftist philosopher. I mean, among other questions we could ask, isn't a case of bigoted expression the worst point to take a stance on like this, given that Denmark and other countries in the EU have restrictions on hate speech? But Zizek really frequently uses racism as his go-to example of speech that's harmfully excluded from the public sphere. What Zizek writes in the New York Times op-ed is excerpted from, or parts of it are excerpted from, a longer essay called Antinomies of Tolerant Reason that you can find on his website. This was also written in 2006. He begins by talking about how fundamentalist Muslim rage comes from their Muslims in general. It comes from an inner sense of their inferiority. He compares their feelings toward us to Hitler's feelings toward the Jews. Zizek is going to compare Muslims, or the Muslim world, to Hitler a few times in this essay. So in the course of his cheap pop psychology about millions of people as a group, he manages to conflate Muslim protesters, or any Muslims, with terrorists, to compare them with Hitler, and affirm the kind of the Bush-era rhetoric about Clash of Civilizations from World War III. The difference that Nazi hatred of Jews was based on propagandized lies is something Zizek doesn't seem to see. He does something similar to what he does in the Times, what he does elsewhere. He sort of posits an antinomy between two positions that he himself conjures. He doesn't actually attribute these views to any existing individuals. He uses these sock puppets of two, Western liberals. It's always these Western liberals that articulate his views. Along the way, taking up this kind of maximally ambiguous voicing between the views he's inventing and his own explanations. So it's not always clear whether any given utterance is attributed to the liberal or it's him explaining their view. In the course of doing this, he talks about how Muslims are humorless, casually mentions that Muslims don't use toilet paper, and that they have a tribal superstition about writing as such, with no concept of secular writing. And yeah, if you squint and force it, there's like a tenuous case that he's speaking in the voice of a Western liberal, but which views? All of it? It's not clear. He does say there is more to this than there may appear. In any case, I don't know of any liberals who think that Muslims don't use toilet paper. The cartoons, he goes on, mark the end of the myth of Scandinavian tolerance. So tolerance was apparently a myth. According to Zizek, and he takes this for granted, racist attitudes were always there, but were just suppressed and intensified. The role of the media, the rhetoric of political leaders, plays no role here, and no actual or possible role in intensifying those attitudes. So Zizek's already smuggled in his conclusion. In the meantime, he presents the prohibition against Holocaust denial caricaturishly as sacred, and as an inner contradiction of liberalism, as he does elsewhere with restrictions on hate speech. He goes on, at this point unambiguously speaking for himself, that Muslim reaction was, quote, rising up to murderous violence and expanding to the whole of Europe or of the West. In all this, the idea that Danish Muslims are themselves Danish, are themselves EU citizens, all of this is pre-excluded. Now, Zizek, who's going to return later to the notion of an essential deadlock in liberal thinking that threatens liberal society, hasn't said why this is an antinomy, rather than just a disagreement or a lapse in the legal regime or its enforcement. We can agree that this incident betokens something about Danish society. Zizek never explains why what it betokens is the intrinsic weakness of political liberalism and how it leaves us open to threats from foreigners rather than, maybe an indication of the way that hostile bigotry from US, UK, and Danish mainstream media aid imperial power through propaganda. He summons this air of inevitability as he allegorizes the incident to a sign of cultural malignancy. He goes on, it's as if the more you tolerate Islam, the stronger its pressure will be on you. Continuing, in the guise of the raging Muslim crowds, we stumble upon the limits of multicultural liberal tolerance, of its propensity to self-blaming and effort to understand the other. Here the other is a real other, real in his hatred. We encounter the paradox of tolerance at its purest. How far, Zizek wonders, should tolerance for intolerance, meaning Muslims, go? So here we come to Zizek's point. Muslims are irrational, along with all the other racist cliches he's kind of casually tossed out here, and they compel us, solemnly, sorrowfully, or whatever, to question the limits of our exquisite tolerance and enlightenment. This argument for the decadence of the pluralism of liberal society, because its indifference to generosity, it permits the backdoor entry of a threat that's going to take advantage of our naive faith in law and an open public sphere. It's an argument with a history. It's the history that's laid out by writers like Sternhell and Ishe Landa in their histories of fascist rhetoric and fascist cultural attitudes. The pattern of Zizek's rhetoric here is identical. He says, what lurks at the horizon if we avoid this path, the deadlock of tolerant reason, and its results, is the nightmarish prospect of a society regulated by a perverse pact between religious fundamentalists and the politically correct creatures of tolerance and respect for the other's beliefs. A society immobilized by the concern for not hurting the other, no matter how cruel and superstitious this other is. And if we had any reason to doubt his contempt is real, he goes on to mention how there's a poetic justice in the fact that the all-Muslim outcry against godless Denmark was immediately followed by a heightened violence between Sunnis and Shia in Iraq. Now, the promised resolution of the antinomy, the supposed antinomy of tolerance, does come at the end, albeit in slightly oblique language. And this is, the quote for this is on the handout too. Tossing in quotes from Peter Sloterdijk, he explains that proximity with alien cultures will inevitably lead to violence. Glossing alienation to mean a distance from others, unlike ourselves in social space, Zizek here using it in a very different sense from Hegel or Marx, to mean a separation from other cultures, says, what we need is more alienation. Then, after spending a couple of paragraphs using Lacanian semiotics to suggest that cultures speaking different languages inevitably have incompatible worldviews and will clash, he adds this gem. He says, perhaps the fact that reason, ratio, and race have the same roots tells us something. So here Zizek goes one better than the Heideggerian Wesenschauung approach to etymology, where the Greek or Latin meaning is the essential meaning of a word instead of just an older one, because this isn't even true. Zizek is just making this up, this etymology. So you guys can tell me why someone would invent a philosophical linguistic myth that reason and race are essentially related. So, continuing on Zizek's interest in multiculturalism, in 2008, Sarah Ahmed, a professor of race and cultural studies, wrote an article challenging Zizek's claim that multiculturalism is hegemonic. There was a conference where he said this repeatedly and that it was an empirical fact, but didn't really explain it. So in his response, Zizek kind of doubles down on his claim, suggesting that Ahmed and others, by defending multiculturalism, are in fact the real racists. Zizek claims with annoyance that the celebration of minorities is the dominant ideology of US and EU culture. He goes on to attack feminism or anti-patriarchy, along the way kind of gratuitously misusing this line from the Communist Manifesto, which uses the term patriarchy in a completely different sense. This is also in the this sheet here. This is in the essay called Multiculturalism, the Reality of an Illusion. He says, the statement that patriarchal ideology continues to be today's hegemonic ideology is today's hegemonic ideology. Its function is to enable us to evade the deadlock of the hedonistic permissiveness which is effectively hegemonic. So Zizek complains here about how liberal rights allow parents to sue their children. Elsewhere he'll complain about how now with all our liberal freedoms people are allowed to fuck their dogs. It's a position you can get from John Derbyshire, anyone else who plays that role, and here it's coming from Zizek. Of course, since Zizek is branded as a leftist, what he ends up doing is kind of re-signifying these views as left. Now note here, Zizek isn't just saying that feminist critics of patriarchy overstate patriarchy's reach. He's saying opposition to and criticism of patriarchy is itself the hegemonic ideology. This is this is bullshit. It's a very common complaint among, for example, men's rights activists that anti-patriarchy is hegemonic. Zizek will make similar claims in this essay and elsewhere about how anti-racism is hegemonic, although obviously there's never been a time in the EU, in the UK, and the US when politicians weren't loudly making the same kind of histrionic complaints that Zizek's making here. This isn't something he's performatively over-identifying with. This is his view, stated in his own voice. Okay, so there's one more thing from this essay that we should look at. Kind of casually, halfway through a paragraph in the course is making another point, similar to how he brings up the Muslims not using toilet paper line. Zizek mentions this incident that happened in Slovenia. He says that there was a Roma family living on the edge of a Slovenian town called Ambrus that was harassing the villagers, stealing from them, making noise and threatening people, and they even killed a guy. The townspeople, he says, formed a vigilante gang to chase them out. This excerpt from the essay is also in the handout. You can look at how he writes about it. So he's using this to criticize the liberals who condemn the townspeople unsympathetically. So, okay, the argument is, the defense would go, he's making a point that abstract condemnation of racism doesn't actually address the causes of the incident, which, okay. But he's not just saying that anti-racism isn't enough, you also need some kind of theory or account of racism. He's attributing anti-racism exclusively to an imagined, anonymous group of sneering, urban, upper-class liberals, comparing them to, this image of the simple townsfolk, these farmers who were left to themselves. You can also see in the handout some excerpts from how The Guardian described the event. Wielding clubs, guns, and chainsaws, several hundred villagers converged on the cottage in a clearing in the beech forest with a simple demand. Sig Laus, Jippos out, they called in German, deliberately echoing Nazi racist chants. Bomb the gypsies. The mob threatened to bomb the family and crucify their children. One witness compared it to Kristallnacht. The police eventually intervened, and they kind of acceded to the mob's demands by relocating the family. They reset the family, the Stroyan family elsewhere. At one point they tried to come back, the family tried to come back to get their stuff, and according to the article, a mob of 1,000 people set up roadblocks and fought with riot police. There's also a New York Times article you can read about this. So, Zizek was apologizing for a pogrom. He repeats racist anti-Roma cliches, that they're dirty, they steal. He falsely accuses them of murdering someone. So it should probably go without saying that none of this is true, none of this was ever corroborated anywhere. But Zizek's interest is in blaming some abstract group of liberals that he's invented. He puts racist in scare quotes. He implies a class contrast between the comfortable liberals who live in the city and the frightened people in their village, which inverts the actual class relationship between the Slovenian majority and Ambrus. Both of the articles describe the town as being upper middle class, and the Stroyan family living at the edge of town. Zizek constantly attributes racism to the working class and anti-racism exclusively to an imagined group of snooty cosmopolitan liberals. It's always racist populism, it's always hypocritical leftists who don't understand that racism is a working class attitude. Somehow, for Zizek, Muslims, immigrants, black people, Roma, get excluded over and over again from Zizek's working class. Somehow, those people are never themselves anti-racist. It's always something that belongs to the working class. Just like for Zizek, in this instance, the locals are the Slovenians, but not the Stroyan family that had been living there for decades. He always does this casually, in passing, as if it's a given. homogenizing working class status with non-Muslim or Slovenian status. Again, this transformation of working class solidarity into ethnic solidarity by deliberately blurring the two in rhetoric is also a specific rhetorical technique that belongs to a specific tradition. This wasn't just a one-time thing. The next year, Zizek gave a lecture where he addressed that there had been some reaction to his misrepresentation of the incident. His only response was to repeat his original claims more strongly. To say, and you can find this also on the sheet, a transcription of what he said at the Birbeck Institute in 2010. He says, oh, according to his son's babysitter, don't idealize them. They really do steal. They really are like this. They, the Roma in general, steal from people, attack people, and so on. Emphasizing again what we know to be false, that it's always upper middle class, or at least middle class people, who are blaming the poor redneck ordinary guys, he says, for being racists. The destroyers themselves apparently don't get a vote in this. So I'd encourage people to pay close attention to how much of Zizek's right-wing rhetoric, his anti-racism, his anti-feminism, his authoritarianism, his valorization of violence as a good in itself, can't be written off as a performance, and to take him seriously in that regard. That he, in fact, does want an authoritarian terror state instead of democracy, does think anti-racism and cultural mixing threaten white Christian Europe. Now, of course, there are some things Zizek says that do still sound left and that don't seem to line up with this. So first off, there are lots of views and utterances that by themselves we might call left-wing or seem leftish that do have a place historically in certain strands of right-wing thought. But there's another thing too. Kotsko's example of over-identification comes from Zizek's time, according to Kotsko, in communist Yugoslavia. So, for example, during fixed elections, Zizek would pretend with exaggerated naivete that the election was really up for grabs, to make the point that it wasn't. Now, if, like Zizek, you think left-wing values dominate and threaten society, as he says, then it just becomes a matter of which values to performatively over-identify with now. That's it.
Thank you, Ethan. We will now hear from Molly Klein, former media analyst with an extensive knowledge of Zizek's career and writings.
Okay, that was really great. I hope everyone followed that. Let's start the story. I'm going to start with a quote from someone who calls himself Turbulent Velvet. Okay, with Zizek, it's the smell, the affect, the affectation. It's the whole functional sociology of what he represents, how he massages the desire of those who endlessly tout him. I think now he occupies for the academic left the same functional position that Nietzsche has. He's the primary current heir of that whole pathology. Nietzsche's hook has always been his identity as an intellectual, his preemption of any other model of what that could mean. Among the many dismal things that he's always seduced out of the left is making an identity as an intellectual supersede other kinds of identifications. Training in Nietzsche appreciation serves a kind of forensic purpose on the left. You have to pass radical muster by showing, on the one hand, that you're passionately angry at all the politically correct causes, but that insofar as your identity as an intellectual is invoked, you'll renounce all your little democratic and empathetic naivete and defend obviously fascist ideas and affect constellations as mere perspectivism or deconstructing aphoristic free play or whatever you're told to say this year. The content of the latest fashionable whitewash reading of Nietzsche isn't as important as the fact that you start working against the humane impulse that would make you object to so many aspects of his writing, and that you experience this suppression as a maturation. Nietzscheanism also provides a training in confusing emotive bombast and aphoristic sharpness for action and engagement. Just those two aspects of the pathology taken together underscore how and why Nietzscheanism could be so easily retrofitted as a proxy for the defense of the corporate institution of the academy. Performing your dangerous Nietzschean thinking is essentially a way of broadcasting that your threat is and never will be anything but rhetorical. That's also the meaning of the most common defense of Nietzsche. His thought, we're told, is so lethal that he'll melt the skull of any pussy bourgeois. But if you press the issue of his fascioid delectations, it's always the same yuppie larf. Oh, come on, he's only joking. During Katrina, a certain very bright commentator remarked about the story of the National Guard holed up for maneuvers in a stadium while children died of thirst on the other side of the wall. That couldn't have been an accident, he said. It was designed to harden, to extinguish moral objection, even with regard to one's own citizens. Left Nietzschean pedagogy serves the same purpose, in a more focused and subtle kind of venue. Bray your moral passion about George Bush and the war, about torture, about sexual repression and tyranny, but when it comes to the academy, when it comes to your identity as a scholar or intellectual, flip switch over to the cool rejection of the bourgeois sentimentality, a contempt for slavish empathy, a fascination with violence, a search for authoritarian daddy figures. Watch where the flip between the two morally and tonally incompatible discourses come. It's always around the threat to the academic and scholarly intellectual identity. Zizek doesn't have an easily traceable Nietzsche influence. I disagree with that, but this is what he's saying. And he inherits this function. In some ways, it's even worse than Nietzscheanism, because at least Nietzsche's exoteric anti-systemic style led to some enduring elaborations of the anarchist spirit. By contrast, Lacan's system is the sort of monstrosity of abstraction that brings out the worst in disciples, especially since it combines memorize and apply hierarchies with the will to power of psychoanalyzing interlocutors from a position of supposed superiority. No Deleuzian creation of concepts for new situations with their risk and difficulty, just interminable readings of movies that pretend to be politically ferocious and threatening to the state. Always the smugness of the old psychoanalytic objection of interlocutors' motivations as a way of avoiding their arguments. Calls to political hatred, unless it's an inconvenient kind of hatred, in which case it's ressentiment or some other pathology. The old mimetic violence, which you'd think a Lacanian would understand, and perhaps they do, since they're so skilled at firing up méconnaissance about it. And of course, there's the absorption of political engagement into mere rhetorical gesture. Zizek's revolutionary gestures are circus antics. He's quite deliberate about designing a space of psychoanalytic radical purity that can only be inhabited emotionally and rhetorically, which of course serve the needs of the academic star circuit that keep him in the style to which he's become accustomed. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so Zizek's similarity to Nietzsche that's being pointed out here is the core of his connection. Sorry. Okay. All right. Is the core of his connection to a long process of rhetorically diverting discourses that are challenging to the state and challenging to the status quo, by poisoning them and transforming them into reactionary discourses or associating them with shameful discourses such as anti-Semitism. And this goes back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the beginning of Zizek's operation is Zizek's type of operation is something similar that was similar to the way the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was created out of a work of 19th century critique that had a lot in common with Marx, a 19th century critique of the government of Napoleon III in France. And sorry, I lost my place here. Okay, and the same kinds of operations that Nietzsche performed on anarchists and critical thought are put into practice by Zizek with these techniques that have been developed for marketing and advertising and also propaganda operations. That I want you to look at your two little handouts here. One of them is this Gambits for Deception, which was part of the Snowden leaks, but it's really just, I mean, they're saying this is what the CIA uses, of course they do, but it's really just a marketing tactics for guerrilla marketing, products, to make products cool, to do advertising that doesn't seem like advertising. And then also this, which we'll get to later, which is the cover of Zizek's book. Okay, so I want to tell the story of how Zizek's I want to suggest that Zizek is something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That has a relationship to Marxism, that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion had to the critique of the status quo of liberal democracy in the 19th century. And this operation that Zizek is performing really began in the West in 1990 when Zizek was invited to write an article in a New Left review, which would introduce to the left, to the Anglophone left, the main strain of propaganda that was going to accompany the destruction of Yugoslavia as the imperial project of destroying Yugoslavia. But okay, so that happened in 1990. He he was a little bit known before that for this book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which is very similar actually to the Protocols. But I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so 1990 is when the story begins of the Zizek deformation of Marxism in the Anglophone world. There are four backstories that lead up to this. One is the post-war is U.S. policy toward the end of the Cold War and for the post-USSR world. The other is what was going on in academia to accompany this. The third is what was going on in Slovenia, where Zizek comes from, and the fourth is what was going on at the New Left Review. And okay, so let's begin with the backstory of the end of the Cold War. And there's a project. The United States, the Empire, went on a mission for the post-USSR world, which was basically to destroy what we normally think of as the post-war settlement and the rule of law, the global rule of law. This is the democracy, parliamentary democracy, and civil rights, human rights structures domestically and internationally, and the Westphalian system that has been established that is guarded by the UN. And so the U.S. project after the fall of the Berlin Wall was to unleash this new conquest of the planet, to go around and destroy all the regional powers one by one, and to erode the system of law and interstate system that had been established, that had been the status quo in the two superpower worlds. Now, in the academy, of course, in academia, all kinds of ideas are produced. Just about everything that you can think of is being produced. And there's no management from the top. But what happens is those ideas that are convenient to the ruling class become promoted. They're rewarded and honored, et cetera, et cetera. And what was happening in the last decade of the Cold War was rewarding things that were useful to this. They're going to be useful to this project of eroding the rule of law and the liberal democracy and social democracy, and destroying the interstate legal arrangements that are the UN charter. So what you had is, of course, famously everybody knows post-structuralism. The French post-structuralists had revived Nietzsche and Heidegger. They put Nietzsche and Heidegger, a proto-Nazi and a Nazi, at the center of their kind of cuckoo discourse, this discourse that would replace Marxism, and that was very popular. And toward the end of the 80s, this was, Schmidt was added, and Schmidt was very importantly added because that is the Nazi, this is the classic Nazi critique of liberalism. And the purpose of this discourse was to erode people's commitments to things like their rights, human rights, because actually as you erode people's commitments, the rights disappear because they are social product. And legitimacy is very important. Okay, so meanwhile, while this is going on, also the New Left Review was one of the places that the New Left Review exists as a bridge between academia and kind of public affairs, journalism, public intellectuals. And the New Left Review was one of the places where the academic fashions were, was a spigot to pour the academic fashions into the normal left-wing public intellectual discourse. Perry Anderson liked Althusser, and a lot of the post-structuralists came along with this. They wrote about Foucault, and they were also sort of connected to Eurocommunism, which was a European. It was something that a name that was given by actually mostly by leftist critics to the direction of the European communist parties at the time to go into social democratic governments and become part of social democracy. Okay. In Slovenia at this time, there was, through the 80s, this was the beginning of Zizek's career. He had been a sort of failed academic, and then he worked for the Communist Party briefly. And then in the mid-'80s, he got involved with what was actually the U.S.-sponsored clique of dissidents who had eventually formed the Liberal Democratic Party, and whose aim was to destroy the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, and also to have to allow Slovenia to secede as a country and take basically most of the treasury of Yugoslavia with it. So they were similar to sort of Pussy Riot. They were funded by U.S. front organizations and sometimes directly to do pranks, basically, and to create a discourse that delegitimized the government of Yugoslavia. It was important that they didn't want, after the death of Tito, there was a democratization that was happening in Yugoslavia. It was going along. It might have been that the country would break up, or that the republic would be reconstituted with different, with a more parliamentary apparatus and everything. But for Slovenia, what was important, the U.S. and Germany at the time wanted to destroy Yugoslavia, break it up, but Slovenia, which is a tiny country of 2 million people, wanted to they wanted to avoid having to pay their debt to the federal government. It was a country of 40 million people, and the 2 million people wanted to take basically most of the public equity of the whole country. So they were determined that Yugoslavia should break up with a war, with a violent war that they would be the good guys in, and the U.S. client. So they started to do these things. Ethan explained some of the pranks that they did, but Zizek got involved with something called the Neue Slowenische Kunst, which was a group that's most famous, that was sort of a Pussy Riot style group, but its most famous element was this band Leibach. And Leibach is the German name of Ljubljana. And Leibach became a hit a little bit in Britain and France as well. And what they did is they originated this idea of over-identification that Ethan was referring to, the idea that they performed as kind of Nazis, and that this was supposed to somehow reveal the Nazi nature of the Yugoslav government. And it was very, the message, their white supremacy and everything that they were performing was understood by the rest of people in Yugoslavia outside of Slovenia, and this has it had a connection to a sort of a style of white supremacy in Slovenia, which is a specifically Aryan white supremacy, the belief that Slovenia, which was never under Ottoman rule, had always been part of the Habsburg Empire, was Catholic, was sort of carried off by the Balkan majority and but really needed to be restored to its European home. And that's what Levich performed and disseminated this set of tropes and this paradigm. At the same time, Zizek, this little group had a bunch of magazines, and there was a journal called Problemi, there was the youth magazine called Youth Mladina, and Tribuna. And Zizek was involved in all of these. Now, in Problemi, he started to develop these ruses. He made himself famous by using sock puppets and pseudonyms to, for example, he wrote a book that was not very successful, a Lacanian book. Lacan was the master of all this. He was the authority that most of these dissidents were honoring. But he wrote a book, and it didn't do very well, but he wrote a pan of it under a pseudonym where he developed this persona to write this attack on his own book, and it actually became kind of a successful book. And this kind of thing he was using these, he developed this theory of these ruses, but also was putting them into practice. Now with Mladina and Tribuna, anti-Semitism was at the core of these practices. And Tribuna in 1988 actually republished the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was the sort of guidebook of all this stuff. Now, this was the first Slovene language edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion since 1945. And they were, the magazine was sued by the Jewish community of Ljubljana, of Slovenia, and the excuse that they gave was that they really mean communists when they were talking about the Jewish plot. They're trying to reveal how communists work. So it's pretty clear. I mean, the intense anti-communism of Zizek is not in question. Then also Mladina arranged. This was his other magazine, another thing they were doing, Zizek and his wife and his group, they were starting to develop the ideology that, the propaganda operation that we all know, which was that this vision of Serb nationalism, that the Serbs were the new Nazis, and this is why the U.S. would have to intervene on behalf of secessionist movements. And Zizek and his wife were the principal propagandists of this view in the press and also to the West. And they staged stuff in the Pussy Riot style. They staged stuff where Slovenes would dress up with wearing Stars of David to suggest that they were the new Jews who were about to be exterminated by the new Nazis, who were the Serbs. This was before Milosevic. Milosevic was the president of Serbia, and it hadn't yet become the president of Yugoslavia. But and they were sued for this as well. And then on the cover of Mladina, after there was a lawsuit about these performances, there was a cover of Mladina that smells of Zizek, that we all know was him, where it said, "What do these Jews want?" And then it said, "Probably money." Okay, so Zizek is at the center of this operation of over-identification and trying to stir up, both abroad, to popularize these ideas of what's happening in Yugoslavia, mostly in France, and this menacing thing. Okay, so now eventually, I'm getting a little ahead of my story because this has happened after the New Left Review, but eventually Mladina took a further step because they wanted to, in fact, this magazine, Mladina, that Zizek was one of the founding editors of, created the crisis that would precipitate the secession of Slovenia. And what they did is they somehow got hold of an intelligence document and threatened to publish it. This document has still not been revealed, whatever it was. They got a hold of an intelligence document of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They were going to publish it. The journalists who were blamed for this were thrown in jail. This became an enormous scandal in Yugoslavia. The dissidents all signed, petitions for them to be free speech and free press, and et cetera, et cetera. We don't know what it says. There was a BBC documentary about this, though, where some of the passages from the inquiry, from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's inquiry into this incident, some of these passages are read on the BBC documentary, among them the statement that the intelligence, of Yugoslav intelligence, saying that Mladina was funded by the CIA. Okay, at the New Left Review at this time, in the 80s, the New Left Review had become sympathetic to a lot of the French post-structuralist stuff, and but it also had these two people working there, Quentin Hoare and Branka Megas, who are a couple. Branka Megas is a Croatian, I think ethnically Croatian. I don't know if she was born in Croatia. The two of them in the 80s had lost faith in socialism, and they became attracted to the Croatian nationalist, separatist Franjo Tuđman, who is a Nazi, a neo-Nazi. And they were not overly, they pretended to criticize his Nazism and everything, and his virulent anti-Semitism, but they saw that, they backed the Croatian nationalists, and they started to use the New Left Review to promote this mythology that had been created, mostly, partly in Slovenia, about the Serbs as the new Nazis. And eventually they were chased out of the New Left Review by Tariq Ali and other people, and he had some comments about it, and I won't read them now because I think I'm going to go long, but they were eventually chased out of the New Left Review, and they went on to found the Bosnian Institute, which was an arm of an important base of this U.S. propaganda, which is also being led by AIPAC, in the destruction of Yugoslavia, that demonized the Serbs and that portrayed them as the new Nazis and the new Holocaust and all this. Okay, so in 1990, after Zizek had published this book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which it's just a book, every fourth word is Jew, it's all about Jews, and it's really quite banal. Theoretically, the important thing that he's saying is that, things aren't what they seem. But it's basically he's rolling out all these old crackpot, all these old motifs that he's picked up from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which they published in Slovenia. Okay, so he goes to the New Left Review in 1990, when Americans have no idea what's going on there, that there's been a financial crisis, that there's separatists. It was a little better known in Britain, but the Anglophone left is basically introduced to the story of Yugoslavia, and he basically, and that's the handout here, Eastern Europeans Republics of Gilead, he basically lays out what is going to be the propaganda for the U.S. aggression against Yugoslavia and later against the rump of Yugoslavia or Serbia in 1999. Okay, so the same kinds of techniques that it's a little bit more subtle now. This is 1990 than in the pieces that Ethan was examining. But the same techniques are being used. And these are that he's got this, there's this ostensible analysis that just as with the later pieces, make use of this imaginary liberal hypocrite, this posh Western multiculturalist who looks at the Balkans and sees, a savage land. And this is another. This was the same story he used to delegitimize the critiques that Peter Handke, the playwright, German playwright, was issuing at the start of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the destruction of Yugoslavia in Germany. He was criticizing the German policy of fostering this secessionist movements, and Zizek attacked him as just wanting to think of Slovenia the way Freud thought of Slovenia as the id. Not civilized. Freud said that Slovenes aren't civilized enough to psychoanalyze, which is something that Zizek is a little bit obsessed with. Okay, so in this Eastern Republics of Gilead, what we get from Zizek is he lays out exactly he sets the stage and he gives us the characters that we're going to see repeated throughout the 90s and up until the 1999 72-day bombing of Serbia. And they are that, but he uses this, he introduces a sock puppet, and in fact he uses all the types that he's going to be laying out as the sock puppets to examine, to say about the other what he really wants to have said. He wants it out there, but he doesn't want to be responsible for it. So he tells us that Serbs think that Slovenes are too hardworking, and Slovenes think that Serbs are dirty and lazy. So he's laying out a kind of racial picture where he is letting the audience know that the Slovenes are the English in this scenario, that they're in the white supremacist scenario, that they're the superior ethnicity, that they are hardworking and save and are more developed, and that the rest of the Serbs are the backward savages. And later, this is something that he develops later in his essay where he is championing the bombing of Serbia in 1999. He says he portrays the Serbs as standing on the bridge defiantly. I think people remember this during the bombing, taunting the U.S. And he says, and look at them, they're cavorting while 300 kilometers away, a genocide of African proportions is taking place. And that's the kind of move that he uses all the time. I've often asked people who defend Zizek, like, was an African genocide supposed to be bigger or smaller than a European genocide? But there's no answer to that, because his idea is that he's just his attempt there is just to portray, to use a series of associations with his racist phantasmagoria, his 19th century racist scheme, to identify the various players in order to carry out his propaganda. So in the Eastern European Eastern Europe's republics of Gilead, he uses the liberal sock puppet to as the excuse to lay out this scheme of the superior Slovenes and the backward, savage Serbs, and also to repeat exactly the propaganda scheme, the propaganda story that he was developing in Slovenia, that the Serbs are the new Nazis. He portrays them as in conflict with every other republic, that they are captive to an idée fixe of their victimologists, and he goes through the whole thing that they're the diagnosis of the Nazis as full of ressentiment, and that there's a dangerous thing, that there's going to be a genocide. Basically he lays it out on the table that, wait for a genocide, and this is 1990, long before that became the main story. Okay, so then that's how he's introduced, and he's not in that piece in 1990 pretending to be a Marxist. This comes a little later, and it's not really clear when. He doesn't in every single environment turn into a Marxist at the same time. But sometime in the mid-90s, he starts to pretend he's a Marxist, and that he's in fact a Stalinist, a raving Stalinist, and he performs as this caricature figure who is, he says, as a Marxist, I just want to say Hitler wasn't violent enough, and make these kinds of, he does this performance in order to provoke people like Adam Kirsch at the New Republic, which we will see. Okay, so in 1990, okay, then after he does this, then he and his wife suddenly have this tremendous fame. It's a little bit strange. They get invited to American universities for semesters in unusual arrangements as guests that they can kind of name their terms. His wife is also working. She did a lot of writing about this, the Serbs as the new Nazis, where she was also reviving a lot of this vocabulary of the protocols, and the image of the Jew as dirty and in a conspiracy and a Bolshevik and behind the communists. That was their association that they were working to propagate, this idea that the Jews were behind the communists. And he presents that in the New Left Review, but as if it were someone else's proposal, and not the proposals that were coming out of his own magazines in Slovenia. Okay, so after this, he runs for Slovene president unsuccessfully, and makes a joke that he just wants to be the head of the secret police. And then then Slovenia secedes as a result of this crisis, and also the fact that the German and U.S. government guaranteed that the secessionists would be loan-worthy, that they would be considered in possession of the treasury that they claimed. And then his party takes power in Slovenia, and they commit an ethnic cleansing. Now, the first thing that they did was, it's thought of as a soft ethnic cleansing, in that they simply erased the identities of 2% of the population, gypsies mostly, and some Kosovo Albanians, people that Zizek called non-Slovenians in Slovenia, so the ethnic other. And Zizek apologized for this. He has never really addressed this ethnic cleansing, although the ethnic cleansing, it was called a soft ethnic cleansing, but people were actually deported. People were taken and driven to Bosnia at the height of hostilities. People who were in danger, they were taken to their deaths. People died. There were lots of suicides. It was not, they didn't round people up and shoot them, but it was definitely bloody. And the point of it was to make a more Slovene, in Zizek's idea, a more Slovene country, and his notion of the Slovene ethnicity is that it's Aryan. Okay, so In 1996 or so, he gave an interview to Gert Levich about this, and where he sort of said, "Oh, my leftist friends hate me for fully supporting my party and its actions, and we made some corrupted moves." And he did a macho thing. Dusan Bjelic, a Yugoslav commentator, said, while soft ethnic cleansing was being carried out, Zizek consistently argued against pluralism and multicultural tolerance and promoted state monopoly and social discipline. This would be in the magazine Mladina, which became an organ of the Liberal Democratic Party. And Zizek was the chief ideologist of this party. Okay, in 1996, he gave an interview to Gert Levich in which he was asked about his political involvement in Slovenia. His statements about immigration in the published interview are disingenuous in the extreme. Okay, so, and anybody who wants to follow that up, that's Dusan Bjelic, Normalizing the Balkans. I put that on the reading list. Okay, so, over the next 10 years, I mean, his career has taken off in the United States to a point, and he starts to become a celebrated commentator, public commentator on, he writes these movie reviews, he's supposed to be explicating Lacan to people, and he starts to promote himself as this raving, this sort of crazed Stalinist, Marxist, complaining that, as Ethan was discussing, basically attacking multiculturalism, feminism, and but in this way that, of course, these things just stand, and political correctness, which just stand in for uppity people of color. And this is the first stage of his fame. Is this pseudo-Marxist act where he is, and during this period he gets this reputation of being very incoherent. Like in some environments he'll sound just like a liberal, and in some environments he will be demanding, he will be seeming to worship violence and demand authoritarian. He seems to advocate terror in other environments. For example, in the Strohan piece, he's very upset about supposedly, somebody is stealing a car. So this incoherence, though, is just superficial. In fact, he's very coherently attacking all challenges to empire, which in the 90s meant mainly attacking the ultra-globalization movement. And he's trying to do a sort of white supremacist Nazi revanchism, where he seeds these themes of old-fashioned biologistic racism, and he's trying to import this old-fashioned Protocolsian anti-Semitism that's very current actually in Eastern Europe and was at that time, into the U.S. and France and Britain. And he hasn't had a lot of success in the U.S. with this, but there is definitely a resurgence of these ideas in France and Britain, as we can see with the recent elections. So, how much time do we have? Okay, so I'm going to try. I haven't really I wanted to give examples of all this stuff, but I have it here if anybody wants to read. And the other thing that he was doing that's very important is he inserted himself between the young people and the classics of Marxism and revolutionary the revolutionary tradition, and doing these introductions to that Verso invited him to introduce Mao and Robespierre, and he basically has created this cartoon image of when he's performing as a Stalinist he's created this cartoon image of the heroic savior, the Thatcher of the left, and anyone can serve this purpose for him. He transforms Robespierre, Toussaint, Mao, Mussolini, Nixon, Leonidas from the movie 300. Any of the figures can serve for this action figure that is, his caricature Stalinist. And then, okay, so I'm going to have to finish up, but the way that there's something called that situationists called Maparisation, which after a French publisher, Mapero, and what this is a name for the kind of détournement that transforms Joly's Dialogue in Hell into the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and what this is to take an argument and to vitiate it, but to imitate it and vitiate it and change a few things in order to keep the structure of the critique and but alter its target. And that is what Zizek has done. He's offering these Golovinsky cuckoos of established arguments. And in the 1990s, he was focused on the alter globalization movement, and his books mimic and transform Naomi Klein's book, and he did this also with shock doctrine, but mainly the no logo and the introduction to no logo. And then he is repeatedly taking, or actually he doesn't even bother anymore with trying to mimic Marxism, but he takes popular lefty positions and seems to adopt them and then vitiates them. He infuses them with racism and anti-Semitism. And at the same time, this has a double effect. On the one hand, he, for the liberals, and we could see this in the review that was done, that he provoked by Adam Kirsch from the New Republic, where Adam Kirsch said, well, he's a fascist, and this is what all communists are, pretty much. I mean, Adam Kirsch looked and rightly analyzed his anti-Semitism and his racism and his idealism, his Schmittianism, and then he said, "But look, this is why the new communists are so bad." So the idea was obviously for liberals to get an impression that communism is a kind of Nazism. And then on the other hand, for another audience, what he's doing, people who are more attracted to his poses and his kind of petty bourgeois, resentimental violence, he's smuggling in, he's feeding them all these anti-Semitic and racist and anti-feminist and views. And at the same time, he uses this cred that he's developed to do just straight disinfo. He has got a few things that he is consistently misrepresenting. For example, he, in almost 2 articles a year, he suggests that Milosevic was tried by the International Criminal Court, and he does this by a sophistry about the Hague. He calls it the Hague Court to confuse the courts. He's always propagating a false story about the the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the American support for Al-Qaeda, or creation of Al-Qaeda there, and all kinds of ruses. I'm just going to get to the last one. The other, another thing that he does is like he was vending this fake Brasiak quote that he patched together from stuff that he obviously found on a Aryan Power website called Scotty, where he's trying to give Brasiak this image as a moderate multiculturalist. He defends Breivik with these misrepresentations. And then one of the other things on the handout, this is sort of my favorite thing, is that he ends that the New Left Review actually printed this, where he's got this passing off basically what is a Goebbels quote as Gramsci. And
Could you repeat the last part, please?
he's passing up what is basically a quote from Goebbels as Gramsci. He says the Gramsci.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and the quote is, and anyone who knows Gramsci would know, it says, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Which sounds like something from a Nazi video game. Anyone would know. For some reason, there's no editorial oversight of his articles at the New Left Review. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to stop. Do I have to stop now? Am I pretty much
Yeah,
done?
I think we need to give
And-
people a chance to
Okay,
respond.
so that's it for now. There's more.
Obviously, there was an enormous amount of material to be covered about Zizek. I think you got to a lot of it, and I want
Oh, I'm
to...
sorry, that's very long.
Do people have questions, responses? Yes?
Yeah, actually, the New Left Review comes up many, many times, obviously.
Right.
That's his name, it was his name, from the beginning. What are your thoughts about the New Left Review? Why is this stuff getting in there?
Is anyone here from the New Left Review? Well, as I said, I thought the beginning, I mean, it seemed pretty clear that they had these right-wingers, they had these Croatian nationalists who were not in charge of the paper, but obviously my guess is that they brought him forward. Now, someone on Facebook the other day said something like, well, I doubt that they chose him, but I don't know. So I'm assuming that that was his introduction. There was from Quentin Hoare and Branka Magus, who went on to create the Bosnian Institute, which is a sort of,
Do you have
crazy fascist. Yeah,
Do you have the Tariq Ali quote?
I do.
Nearby, that's, I think, eliminated.
Okay, and after that, why do they keep publishing him? I wish somebody had come from the New Left Review and Verso, because I want to ask them why they keep publishing him. I mean, one of the things is he's obviously very profitable. He's one of the only books that really sell. But on the other hand, it's fascist and racist. A lot of people defend him who haven't actually read his books, or who are so titillated by his forbidden stuff that they have reactions that are almost like hysterical. That how dare you? I always think of it like the classic kind of repression, like how dare you say Dora's father could possibly be molesting her, or something like that. There's this kind of reaction, but I think mainly it's that a lot of people pretend to read stuff they don't, and that's a big factor. But I don't know. I think they should stop publishing him. Actually, I think.
So
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the panel, and so correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Is the panel's position that Zizek is a propagandist orchestrated by the CIA?
The panel doesn't have a position on that.
I'll tell you that the CIA doesn't do these kinds of things anymore.
If that's the
It's
position,
usually the
that's
NED or
I just don't
other.
see it. I
That's not
apologize.
their
Yeah.
position.
No, I mean, my position is that it's not, to me, this is a very fishy operation. I don't understand how he because it's not just that the New Left Review that may be doing it because they don't have anyone else who makes this kind of money. It's the BBC, Le Monde, the Nouvel Observateur, Le Monde
Okay, so
Diplomatique.
are the millions, and I have nothing invested in Zizek at all,
Yeah.
I really don't. But is it an issue that then the millions of people that you follow his work, either very in-depthly or superficially, are they just missing the boat? Are they brainwashed? I mean,
I
how does
don't know
that
if there
work?
are millions.
Yeah, I mean,
Indiana.
sorry, just
Yeah.
like I don't know. I've heard a lot of excuses for this stuff, which are, oh, it's like a typo, or oh, he's just like playing around or something. I mean, I've pointed out some of the things that I mentioned, which are like, no, he means it. I mean, he says that he means it.
But okay, but still, there's a difference between
Okay,
someone
let's-
who's an ambiguous writer, such as you evoke Nietzsche, right? I mean, you write aphorisms is inherently going to be ambiguous.
Well, the stuff Nietzsche
And
writes
you go
about the
left
Jews
wing
is
or right wing,
ambiguous.
right? But it's another thing to say that he's doing this on purpose to be a propagandist.
Well, look, I mean, I don't know. I haven't spoken to Zizek. I've heard different theories about, like, oh, well, I don't know, my explanation is my position is he's doing the ideological work that I said he's doing. Whether or not he's, like, the PSYOP thing isn't my line. Molly can speak for herself on that. Personally, my position is you could take that as a harmless provocation, like when Zizek says Muslims don't use toilet paper, or that Breivik can teach us lots of stuff about multiculturalism. My position is he's doing the ideological work that he is in fact doing. As far as what he tells himself at night, I don't know. It seems like in my conversations with people, the reasoning seems to be, well, Zizek says interesting stuff. I'm not racist, but I like Zizek, so therefore he's not racist. I mean, you have to ask them.
Okay, but even then, so if it's millions or let's say hundreds of thousands of people, only 2 people in the world are able to decipher this kind of propaganda coming from Zizek.
But lots of people have written about it
Lots of
publicly
people write
in
about it.
Public, in Jacobin, all over the place. I mean, there's lots of articles pointing this stuff out.
Yeah, and also that
I can send
as
you
far
links,
as the
you can
CIA
Google
thing, I mean, if you can go on, you can look at his, on YouTube, for example, at one point, he's talking in a meeting of of his party, this liberal democratic party in Slovenia, and he says, he takes credit for being the chief ideologist of the Greens of Iran, and the guy sitting next to him said, oh really, did you really do that? And he said, oh yes, and in fact they started having articles across Iran about how I was the CIA's liaison to the Greens. So I'm not the only person who thinks this. This has been, but also, and then in another YouTube thing, you can see him talking in Brazil, and somebody begins to heckle him and says, you work for the CIA or you work for the US, because it's kind of obvious that he's working. Also, his early career, the part in Slovenia, he doesn't deny. I mean, he talks about his being a political provocateur whose aim was to destroy Yugoslavian socialism. You know, he brags about it. You can see in one of his crazy lectures about Mel Gibson and Simone de Beauvoir, where he gives this argument. You have to see it to believe it, where he says, if you deny that black people are inferior, you're the real racist, because you're not really saying how powerful white racism is. That it in fact has performative efficiency and makes black people actually inferior and white people superior. And in that piece, he goes into his history in Slovenia of doing these provocations. This is something that he discussed. If he doesn't admit to doing things in the U.S., but this is his career, and you know that's his. It would be surprising if he were unable to, or that it would be so strange.
Sorry, one last thing on that point, just quickly. To the whether or not Zizek is in this role is an empirical question. I think Molly's made a good case that there's stuff fishy about it. If I have doubts about it, it's not because of some naive faith that this sort of thing doesn't happen. The CIA and the State Department have a long history of
for a second.
Okay, fair enough.
Hannah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was going to be on this panel to present the psychological perspective, which has to do with it's really the historical materialist perspective. Why do so many people like Zizek? What is it that's appealing about him? Why are so many people enamored of him? I mean, I think he has the persona. I always think of Bakunin or Ahmed Shaki, for example, this sort of, blustering. And he, if you read a little bit, like most people do, not a lot, I read the book.
Yeah.
I looked at the first sentence of each chapter.
Right.
And they hear his name, and there's not a hell of a lot else on offer in the mainstream press. It's not just young, white, petty bourgeoisie men who are attracted to this. There are a lot of people.
Though mainly.
It is. No.
Yeah.
And so that was my next question is,
Yeah.
who is attracted to him? What is their class? What cultures are they? We need to really understand this. And some of the people who are attracted to him, that's what happens with the petty bourgeoisie. Some will move to the right and some will move to the left. And I think one of the most important things we can do, and that I think this panel is part of, is finding the people and talking to them who are into Zizek and trying to pull them to the left rather than to the right. And so that is, I hope, what, this discussion could be. But, from a historical perspective, psychologically, how does this kind of person in history, what kind of role have they played? How has this kind of propaganda been effective or not in the past? And what can we most effectively do to counter it? And not to say, oh, Zizek, oh, you like Zizek, you petty bourgeoisie fool. But to say, wow, I read him and some of his stuff is really interesting. Tell me what you like about it. I'll tell you what I think is questionable and some of what I know. It's just like basic organizing stuff.
In my humble opinion, this
I
whole
think we need to
conversation
move on to the
seems
next
like one big
questioner,
next line to
please.
me.
Excuse me, I think
One
you
big next
you
line.
have plenty of time, sir.
Yeah, well, what Hannah said is very relevant to what I had in mind. The reason I came here is because a couple of people that we didn't work with valued this stuff. So I said, my God, I better.
Exactly. Right. That's how they get to
There
it.
is a history here
And
that's.
one of those two people is a Mexican Trotskyist who's getting a graduate degree in a European university, with whom I correspond a great deal. So he starts getting all
That's
this
right.
Zizek bullshit, and I said, well, I better find out more about it. Now, this was extremely useful to me, both talks. And if you have it on the internet, I would like to know where I can send it to this person in particular. So afterward, I'll.
Molly has a big anti-Zizek.
I have a big
Molly has
anti-Zizek.
single-handedly
But the thing about-
smashed him.
No,
I want to
but-
stress that it's not the first time.
The
There's
CIA,
Yeah,
but the
okay.
CIA thing, while he was active in Yugoslavia, I can see why the CIA, as part of its attempt to influence the development of politics in Yugoslavia, the direction they would like to see, might have been involved in. But once he abandoned that field, I find that if they are broadly rational agents, which of course they may not be, as we know only too well, but if they're broadly rational agents, I think they will be wasting their money, their effort, at the CIA to bother with a guy like this. I find that really far-fetched. When he was in Yugoslavia, it's possible, because he was tied to a political party that actually won the election. So, but once he left that scene, the issue that Hannah raised, I think, is a critical one. You have addressed the issue of why New Left Review went for him, but that by no means the only people who go for him, or the only journals that go for him.
Yeah.
So what is it, other than New Left Review, that gets this left-wing journal? I don't mean the BBC, they're not left-wing obviously, but left-wing journals. I believe he was at least at one left arm before it was in a couple
was
of years
what?
ago, on the plenary. So what
Yes.
is it? Is it that the left has degenerated so much? That would be far more something to worry about than
Absolutely.
that we collectively speaking, have degenerated so much.
Well, there's
That
this.
fall for this or
Yeah.
what?
There's this traditional thing. I mean, in the early 20th century, it was called the socialism of fools. And there's
What?
the socialism of fools, which was the name for political anti-Semitism that was based in, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, the interesting thing about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is it's a vitiation of an actually very good book. So people are attracted to. A lot of people don't know what it. Actually, in the United States, people don't know what it says. In Europe, people have read, are familiar with this. But the reason that people were attracted to that book is it's got a lot of good stuff in it. Now and then it lays it over this crazy story of the Elders of Zion. But the actual analysis of how power works is excellent analysis. It's by this guy, Maurice Joly, from the middle of the 19th century. It's very similar to Marx, and it's a real political analysis. And in fact, what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was, which I keep raising also because it's important to Zizek, and he published it, was that it was the first case of demonizing the kind of political analysis that Marx does in his in the 18th Brumaire as complotisme, as the paranoid fantasy of a Jewish conspiracy or a conspiracy. So that's the first case of that, and this is something that the left is dealing with all the time, is this kind of demonization of any kind of political thought as any critique of the praxis of the ruling class as conspiracy thinking.
I just forgot to say, I invited Zizek to come to the panel.
You did?
And he emailed me back, and it was one word, seriously? Just in case you had any doubts about
Oh, too bad.
himself.
Himself.
He
Well,
just, like,
actually,
seriously
he
would
does
dare
answer
to criticize
me. I put stuff on the web all the time. I mean, I argue with people all the time about him, and he has answered me. I mean, one of the things is that you read, his bringing up to reiterate his slanders of the Stroyan family, which is really horrific. And he was instrumental in inciting this pogrom against them. And that was in reply to stuff that was argued on the web. You know, where he was being accused of lies, and so he justified them. Yeah.
My only relation, I've got the first pages of a couple of books. I couldn't, it was too dense and weird and
Yeah.
whatever. It was, so a lot of what I understand comes in the 30 minutes I've been here, 40 minutes I've been here. What it sounds like you're describing is something a lot like Lyndon LaRouche.
Yes, it's very like Lyndon LaRouche.
And the thing about LaRouche is that bothers me is my friends who are journalists, like myself, will often go on a panel with a bunch of LaRouches, and I'll say, look, some will tell me, look, I can't get published anywhere else except in a LaRouche publication, and there is no, you don't get paid by anyone else, or they don't pay you. And but I told one friend, look, if you go, we generally presume that he's an infiltrator of some kind. He's paid by the other side, and these guys are, the LaRouche people. Therefore, if you do go up on a panel and you want to get some attention, you may want to say, I don't agree with everything, that the LaRouche group says, and then make your own presentation to kind of distance yourself. But they don't want to hear this stuff. It's like, there's something, I don't know, I question the reader, the writer, and I'm really curious about the New Left review now, because I kind of respected it. It's dense as hell.
I'm not accusing them of, I think that they're probably just he's their star. But I think when he was introduced there, that they had a motive that they weren't yet admitting. I mean, they had these two people who were pretending to be communists, and 5 years later they were running the Bosnian Institute and helping the U.S. to.
What do they stand for, the Bosnian Institute? Did you elaborate?
They're a U.S. propaganda organization, and they back the U.S. clients in Yugoslavia. They back the neoliberal privatizing parties of Yugoslavia. And they do kind of pretty disgusting revisionism. I mean, they're obsessed with trying to argue the numbers down of the number of Serbs who were killed by the Nazis. They put out some kind of creepy stuff. Although, of course, in a very in a dignified package, but they're and they were supporters of the Croatian separatists who were, flew the Ustasha flags and, crazy people.
And I want to make one comment, which is just that Molly didn't really have time to get into it, but really, since Zizek got this platform with The Guardian, which is distributed worldwide through the internet and has a pretty big audience, it seems to me that his columns about worldwide political affairs always have the same thrust. That is to say, he always ends up on the side of whatever the agenda of Western imperialism may be at the time, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, or whether it's in his column about the torture in Guantanamo that essentially ends up, I think, as an apology for the torture in Guantanamo, in which he adopts precisely the same arguments that Rush Limbaugh famously did, basically saying that what happened in Guantanamo, as we can see from the, I'm sorry, Abu Ghraib.
Yeah.
As we can see from the Abu Ghraib pictures, was really no more than a sort of fraternity prayer. And I wanted to make one more observation, which is that one of the things that the legacy of Zizek that I think is most damaging in some ways is that he puts himself forward, and Molly mentioned this briefly, as a sort of prism through which university students view the classic works of Marxism. And he does this by writing forewords to these classic works, which seem to me to have the purpose of confusing and obscuring and obfuscating what these works really say. A good example would be his introduction to Mao's essay on contradiction, and also his essay on praxis. And Zizek's forward, these are remarkably straightforward works of political analysis from Mao. Whether you agree with them or not, there's really not much question about what Mao is saying. He's a very, very lucid and straightforward thinker. But Zizek, it seems to me, in his forward, deliberately tries to complicate the argument, throwing in references of all kinds, sort of showing off his familiarity with pop culture, with literature, with history, which I might add is a wide but superficial familiarity. But he also includes in this forward outright falsehoods, and I'll give you an example. He says that Mao felt that the Great Leap Forward, this attempt to industrialize China at high speed in 1958. 58, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 1958. That Mao said that this would kill half of China and that it would be worth it. What's fascinating is that if you look up the source of this quote, it comes from the Chang and Halliday biography of Mao, which was actually so full of slapdash scholarship, distortions, and outright propaganda that even Nick Kristof found it offensive. And if you look up what Mao actually said, it comes from, you can find it in a footnote in Chang and Halliday. They're minutes from a meeting of a communist committee about the industrialization and how it's going. And what Mao says is that he's worried that it's going too fast. And he says the most important thing is the preservation of human life. And he basically says...
Are you apologizing now for Mao?
Yes,
what
you're
I'm doing,
apologizing for
yeah,
Mao.
no, can I finish? I'm telling you what the minutes actually say.
That's
And
bullshit.
that, no, it is. This is what the minutes actually say. Whether you agree, this is not a
But
debate.
there are much more serious people than
May I finish?
documented.
May I finish? What he's quoting a specific document, and you can look up the document. And what Mao is saying is, if the pace of industrialization doesn't slow, then half of China could die.
And
Mao is actually
that
arguing.
settles Mao's record? That settles the issue? That's one quote?
Fair enough.
Well, he's not
What this
commenting on
establishment-
Mao's record,
not-
he's commenting on the misuse of the Mao
Zizek
quote.
does this all the
Zizek's-
time. I pointed out another where he quotes Marx talking about patriarchal societies disappearing in Europe. He's talking about like planned societies, and Zizek quotes this to say even Marx thought that patriarchy was over and that feminism doesn't need to exist. He does this all the time. I mean, whatever you think of Mao, like in that particular instance, he's using Mao as a sock puppet to say something that Mao is not saying in that case. He does it with Marx,
He
he
did
does
the
it with
same thing with
Lenin.
Aristide, he does the same thing with Chavez, there's a
That may
constant
be, but I think it's
misquoting of
also
Lenin.
important to look at the historical record and make some sort of an assessment about how many people did die.
But it's not a lecture about Mao.
Well, it's not, but I think it's fair to sort of express a concern about what actually did happen.
Yeah,
Whatever, we can debate over whether somebody quoted this phrase on record.
You
That's
criticize-
important, but it's also important to think about and acknowledge how many lives may have been lost as a result of certain.
You can criticize Mao without claiming that Mao said something he didn't say.
Right, I'm just sort of trying to find
Okay.
But it's also a systematic thing with people that you may not feel the same way about. For example, Aristide, he quotes him as exactly the opposite, as proposing that the Laplace Party necklace the rich at their swimming pools. I mean, he pretends and he says, you know, that he used gangs that were like the Tonton Laput. I mean, this he says about Aristide. So every, yeah, it is, but it's every left wing.
So I guess we need to vacate the room, and I want to thank everybody very much. I think it was a very interesting and productive debate.